It's great to be here today and to hear from these powerful speakers. I'm so encouraged by the crowd that we have here today and that are joining us for 3 days to talk about how we can work together and collaborate to tackle the very difficult challenges that we face. John Gardner founded Common Cause almost 50 years ago because he said everyone is organized but the people. Banks, big pharma, oil and gas, other interests, they had representatives that were lobbying on Capitol Hill and in state legislatures across the country, and they were also giving huge campaign contributions, and they often got what they wanted. So we formed Common Cause to be taking on the special interests and to be working on ways that the people's voice can be heard in our democracy. So Common Cause worked at the state and local level and at the federal level to move transparency reforms, freedom of information reforms, ethics, campaign finance and lobbying reforms, as well as election reforms. Not because they're an end to themselves, but because they allow people to take on power so their voices are heard in elections, that district lines aren't drawn to stifle people's voice, where politicians choose voters instead of the other way around. So that work continues now, and many groups have joined this movement, which I think is so important because we will never win if we don't have more people joining this. I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges our movement faces and what we need to do to take advantage of this opportunity where millions of people understand that our system is broken and it needs to be fixed, and we need to capitalize on that. First, I think we can learn some lessons from the right. One of the challenges we've faced over the last few decades is that the far right has invested millions of dollars in tackling and taking down the reforms we pass. Millionaires like the Koch brothers provide funding for think tanks, endowed chairs at universities, legal groups like Jim Bops so that they can sue every campaign finance reform bill that's been passed at the state and federal level, and help to bring us things like Citizens United decision. They've also funded right-wing media sources, groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, to work with state legislatures to move an anti-government, an anti-regulation, and an anti-democracy platform, and move that at the state level. They also fund organizations that work with thousands of ground troops who are working on get out the vote and encouraging and voting for candidates. And in between elections, they spend their time recruiting far more people to get involved. We don't have this kind of infrastructure yet, and that's what we have to work on. We have to look at this as a long-term effort to be moving reforms that break down barriers to participation. And frankly, we need donors and funders to support that work over the long haul. We also need to recognize there's no silver bullet. There are a lot of single-issue organizations out there that work on redistricting or reforming the Electoral College or many other issues. All of those are important, and there's no one single issue that trumps all others. We also need to simultaneously be tackling institutional and structural racism. One way to do that is also to be looking at the reforms that we need to move with an equity lens to see if there's unintended consequences or this is making a situation worse. This is important for our movement to be doing. We don't have a reflective democracy. 51% of our population are women, yet they only hold 29% of the seats at the local all the way up to the federal level. Women of color hold 4% of the seats, even though they represent 20% of the population. This isn't an anomaly that happens in red states. This is in blue states, red states, and purple states. And thank you to the Women's Donor Network for that research. We need to be making it easier for people to run for office, not because we want it to be reflective for its own sake, but because of those life experiences that people bring to this work. so that in a place like Connecticut, where I helped lead an effort to move small donor public financing, candidates who weren't wealthy could afford to run for office by collecting small contributions and getting a grant. And they could bring their issues to the table. They didn't have to listen to the special interests that gave them money. Instead, they could listen to their constituents. And what did they want? Juvenile justice reform, ending the death penalty, environmental reforms. So that is why this matters. We also need to break out of our echo chamber and just talking to ourselves. The truth is, when Common Cause is working on issues on voting reforms like automatic registration, small donor public financing, redistricting reforms, ethics, we work with Republicans and independents. It isn't just progressives that support this work. It's hard to imagine when we look in D.C. and see the dysfunction there, but the truth is we are moving these reforms in 2016 and 2017 with bipartisan and transpartisan support, and that's important. We also need to recognize that democracy is 365 days a year. It is not just around election time. We see groups come in and funders come in to focus on the 3 months before an election. The truth is we need to be engaging people after the election. We need to hold candidates accountable to their promises. We need to move legislation that can make a difference for people's lives. These are not ends in themselves. This is so that we can have the clean water that we need for our communities, the clean water for places like Flint, Michigan. And that's why we need to move these reforms. We also need to recognize that the states and localities are leading the way, and you will hear over the next couple of days inspiring stories of how that is happening now. So when you're thinking about the challenges we face in Washington, D.C., I believe the states and cities are going to be leading the way for this reform effort. One of the things that I think about when I think about some of what we're facing, I am inspired by the millions and millions of activists that are protesting in the streets, and not just to resist the Trump administration, their actions on immigration or health care. They are joining our group. Our membership has catapulted to be well over 1 million. They want to be engaged in moving these reforms at the state and local level. They want to be part of the fights for redistricting and voter access. And so that's what inspires me, and I'm very excited to work with all of you as we come together in these gatherings over the next couple days so we can figure out how we can work together on this work. Thank you.